Please help welcome Prad Sekar.
Thanks. Thanks, Jonathan. And thank you to the CannaTech team. This is the third time I've had a chance to be on stage to speak at the events throughout Israel, Sydney, and now Panama. So appreciate the opportunity to be up here and share what we're doing. Also like to thank Dr. Espinoza before, as well as for Gary, to talk about what we're going to be segueing into here in terms of the value of what we call as real-world evidence, clinically validated data to support the industry. So my name is Prad. I'm the co-founder and CEO of CB2 Insights. Just before I start, a little background about who we are and what we do. So in 2014, I'd previously spent the last 15 years running medical centers in Canada with a variety of physicians, specialists, wellness therapists. And in 2014, one of the licensed producers during the whole new MMPR program approached and said, can you help us sell our company to doctors? Because now we need doctors to prescribe cannabis. And we said, okay, that's an interesting shift. I didn't even know about the cannabis industry before, so I was pretty much a skeptic and starting to get into it and understand what is cannabis, what does it fit into the medical components. And we went out and spoke to a number of our physicians, and we said, hey, look, here's this company. They're creating these standardized medicines. They want to sell this to patients. What do you need in order to write a prescription? And they said, we're not going to write one. And we said, what do you mean you're not going to write one? And they said, well, I don't think cannabis is even legal. Like, what is this? Like, how do I prescribe cannabis? And for most of you that come from markets that have a newly appointed medical program, you're all going to face the same barrier that Canada faced in 2014. Now, the majority of physicians didn't say no, we don't want to prescribe cannabis. What they were actually saying was, no, we don't have enough information about how to integrate cannabis into our existing practice, right? I have patients, I'm busy, I have various other therapies I have to treat my patients on. How do I understand where does cannabis fall into my criteria? How does it fall into my treatment plan? So this led us down a path to understand, I think what cannabis needs here back in 2014 was evidence in order to actually assist clinicians in the way that they understood how to prescribe medical cannabis. Now, you could argue that there were a number of trials, and as Dr. Espinoza was saying before, it was a relatively patient-driven industry, so there was a ton of anecdotal data, but you can't expect a clinician who's been used to prescribing and treating medicine in a certain way to suddenly adopt a new way of understanding a product and integrating it within their practice. So you had to somehow bridge this anecdotal industry with the fact that they were limited to small-sized clinical trials in existence and somehow make it available to physicians because guess what? The train had already left the station. We weren't talking about introducing a product where we had time to develop this. So that's a little bit of what CB2 Insights is and what we're doing. So something really great happened last year in the US, which we are really excited about. It also just so happens that most of our work is in the US, so this is even more exciting for us. So the FDA has been using what we call as real-world evidence for many years until now. If you're a pharmaceutical company, you've developed a product and you put that product into market, the FDA had a system called the Sentinel system. Basically, the Sentinel system was plugged into hospitals, electronic health records, claims data from insurance companies, and they were saying, how do I track how this new pharmaceutical product is doing in the market today? So, is it causing more hospitalizations? Is it causing more deaths, et cetera? So this was the concept of real-world evidence from FDA's perspective. Now, last year in December, what the FDA did was a little revolutionary for us. What they basically said is that now we can extend the use of real-world evidence. We can take information that's happening every day outside of traditional clinical trials, and pharma companies can now use this information for one of two really important reasons. Number one, increase the indications of an already approved FDA product. Okay? So if you are GW Pharma, for example, and you have an approved Epidiolex, what other indications can it be used for? Well, traditionally, I'd have to invest hundreds of millions of dollars into clinical trials and run a stage 1 to 4 clinical trial in order to validate it. But now real-world evidence could be used to either support or sometimes not even require me to have to go through that stage. Think of all the cost savings and ease and accessibility of bringing a new product to market. Okay? The second thing that happened is they said you can use it to identify new indications for which you may want to develop new molecular products for. So how do I determine if I have a potential molecule that I think will be able to help with a certain condition, get through the stages of stage 1 to 4 faster? Well, I can use real-world evidence potentially as a way to do this. Now, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but what this basically means is that now we have a new improved way, according to the FDA, to take data that didn't come from traditional clinical trials, and if you're a producer or manufacturer of a product, you have now significantly improved your chances of getting to the endpoint faster and cheaper, right? Now, when you look at real-world evidence, it's starting to become a buzzword. There's conferences happening globally around the world, and all the big pharma are now jumping into this. Just as an example, for some of you who may not know this, last year, Roche bought a company that was developing real-world evidence in the space, Flatiron Health. They bought them for $2 billion. Now, because they can acquire their way to data, you know who's the most valuable in the space now? Your doctor's office. Because all the information that they're storing inside their office is what we have now dedicated as the largest source of real-world data. So almost 85% of real-world data now comes from an electronic health record system of some sort. You go to your physician. He prescribes you. She prescribes you. You then ask that physician to say, how's it working? How am I doing every time I come back? Well, guess what? This is what we call as information outside of a traditional clinical trial. You might term it observational trials. You might call it pragmatic clinical trials. But really what it is tracking a patient in a clinical setting using regular clinical treatments over time. Now you can see how this starts to become more exciting. Because as we see more clinics opening up, as we see more markets opening up, we start to understand the value of taking anecdotal data, applying it in a clinical setting in a way that has now been traditionally accepted as a form of information, and potentially using that to help advance the cannabis industry. Now, I always say this, if cannabis wants to play in the same sandbox as other medications, it better start having the same discipline as the other medications, right? That's the only way it'll get accepted. So if you're a skeptic, become a believer. How do you become a believer? Understand the effects in the same way. So as we're looking to transform cannabis into mainstream healthcare, which is what our vision is at the end of the day, we believe that the way we're going to get there is by effectively creating more and more real-world evidence so that we get better at producing better products, we understand how to better educate clinicians at the point of care, we understand how data drives improved decision-making and better acceptance overall. So just a little bit about how we actually do this, and I'm going to talk about some of the findings that we found through some real-world evidence. So we have 3 platforms. Our first platforms are clinics. So we operate the largest network of clinics in the US today that service patients for medical cannabis. We've seen over 250,000 patients in the last 4 years, and we currently see about 65,000 unique patients every year. These are medical centers staffed by physicians and nurses and medical frontline staff. So patients are coming in through referrals, or they're self-referring and saying, I think cannabis could be helpful for me. We're saying, fine. Let's see how it integrates into your healthcare plan. The second thing that we have is technology. This is proprietary, in-house built technology. Now, for most of you that have tried doing research in healthcare before, it's nearly impossible with any existing electronic health record system because the doctor types everything, right? When you type, you can't pull data. It's useless. So we created our own that's basically database-driven. And we went one step further. We looked at over 500 cannabis trials, literature, published studies that had taken place around the world. We looked at protocols from universities, from academics, from producers themselves, and we said, what are the protocols that are being used in traditional clinical trials? If you're a patient and you're going through a clinical trial, what are the questions asked? How are you being followed up? What information is being gathered? So that at the end of the day, when I say I have proof that my product helps patients with chronic pain, over 500 patients tested, we have applied all those same protocols, except we say we can prove it over 15,000 patients. Okay, so traditional clinical trials are great, best source of data, but they're limited in scope and you tend to not have as many patients go through them. In the real world pragmatic trials, you can broaden that as wide as you want. Okay? So that's what our technology does. And then finally, our insights. So we have our own data analytics teams that takes this information and figures out, okay, great. Go to a physician and tell them that cannabis has no side effects. What's the reaction you're going to get? Probably that's bullshit, right? Everything's got a side effect. Okay, so how do we identify side effects? So now we can actually determine and tell you drug-to-drug interactions. We can tell you which cannabis strains with which products and pharmaceutical products are probably not going to work as well. We can tell you what the risks are. We can tell you what the contraindications are. How do we generate this? Again, analytics and insights that are driven through real-world experience. We're not the only ones doing this. So we're also capturing data from all the other research trials that are taking place as well. So let's take a look at a case study. Last December, we wanted to put something out for Christmas, just, hey, here's a little Christmas data report. This is not what we traditionally do. We don't put out reports. We use the data to help feed analytics, but just as an example, this is something I wanted to put up here. So we went through a protocol where we looked at 16 of our clinics in the US. And over a 4-week window, we took a look at the patients. we wanted to identify, someone told us as a hypothesis, how many of the states in the US actually have the indications correctly? Meaning, are we actually setting up regulations? So how does real-world evidence get used, right? Production facility, fine. But even from a regulatory perspective, how do I know what I need to have as an indication list? So through the standard data protocols that we've been running through our clinics, here's some of the findings that we found, right? I actually want to go to the next slide, but if this is interesting for you, I want to stand here for a second. Okay. Majority of the states in the US don't list mood disorders as a primary condition for diagnosing a patient. Okay? Some states allow freedom and flexibility for the physician to say, fine, go ahead and recommend as you choose to, but the majority of them don't allow for mood disorders. However, what does real-world evidence show? What kind of information can we gather from electronic health record systems that today you cannot gather through any of the other data-driven software that we're doing in the industry today? Well, primary conditions. Most patients coming in for one condition suffer from usually 2 to 3 other conditions. How do those conditions affect the first condition? A unique finding that we did find was how the US is missing their boat, just simply based on not understanding the profile of patients that were being treated for conditions, because most of them were self-reported. And with most self-reported treatments, patients are self-reporting treatments that are ultimately going to get them access to the industry. So if I'm going to go in and see a physician who's not going to necessarily assess me the same way, I know the state-level qualifying criteria. I'm going to be one of those. Right? So identifying patients at a core through a setting that's not traditionally used to gather data allows us to go one step further and find information that could help just regulators at a large better determine how I'm going to create a new cannabis program. So for some of you who might be looking at the new countries that are emerging, what conditions should qualify, what should not qualify? Now, mood-related also happens to be one of the only ones that's a contraindication, which means that most physicians won't prescribe to a patient with mood disorders. That's a great area for research. We focus on chronic pain a lot, but what about mood disorders? It's one of the largest populations of patients today. So again, just information that we thought could help drive better decision-making, whether you're a producer, a manufacturer, an extractor, part of a government regulations program, a physician. What we do know is that real-world evidence must advance. We know that real-world evidence is being captured in all areas of healthcare, but we know that it's not being focused on as much in cannabis because we haven't gone down to the molecular level of cannabis yet. We're still growing flower and we're selling it as flower. We haven't yet determined how to control the dosage. It hasn't been scaled to the same level. We haven't gone through enough FDA approvals. But in order for cannabis to get there, and I truly, as much of a skeptic as I was back in 2014, now start to believe that cannabis does have an efficient place in a patient's treatment plan, I can tell you that in order to get there, we need to drive down this road further. So, as I end this conversation here, we're around. I actually am leaving today, but my colleague Summer will be here all day tomorrow. I'd love to chat. A copy of this data report is actually in full on our website at cb2insights.com. If you just want to go and take a look at it, it's free download. And more importantly, if you're a producer, if you're a manufacturer of cannabis, let me ask you this simple question. How much data and what quality and discipline of that data do you think you need today versus as the market starts to get more competitive and as cannabis starts to actually become part of the healthcare spectrum, where do you think that that data needs to go? And how much do you think that research or clinical trials or real-world evidence projects are a part of getting you there? If you think it's important, we'd love to have a chat. And we'd love to share some of our findings and approaches and hopefully as a whole, get this industry to develop a little bit more clinically. Thank you very much. My name is Prad. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Prad.